Hey YouTube, this is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about 3 underrated decks for this current June 2025 Alliance Insight format. These are decks that have seen a few results here or there, but haven't really reached the same level as some of the other decks that I talked about in my top 10 decks for the June 2025 format. So if you want to get a better idea of what the best of the best is, then be sure to check that video out. It's already up on my channel. But in this video, I want to talk about 3 decks that I think have the potential to make more of a meta impact in this upcoming format. Alright, so starting off with the first deck, it's going to be Kashtira Regenesis. This list got top 8 at the Indianapolis Regionals, and I think the general playstyle of this deck is more of a control or mid-range style. It doesn't really set up a massive board, but the cards all trade fairly well into the opponent's stuff, and perhaps the biggest draw of the deck is that they all generate follow-up by adding themselves back to the hand after being used for that turn. So for example, a card like Regenesis Dragon, once you use it on your opponent's turn, you get the interruption effect and then you get it back as follow-up during the next turn. This is a deck that aims to build up its resources over time and then just overwhelm the opponent by just summoning big 2500 beaters, and it's usually played with the Kashtira engine, and I think that's one of the main reasons for its success so far. Unicorn is still such a strong card, being able to rip out one-ofs like Detonator in the extra deck, and Kashtira Fenrir can be good in more simplified game states. And I guess speaking of simplified game states, I think this deck thrives when it's able to simplify the game state with cards like Charmies, since its grind game is so good and the cards just standalone trade quite well into the opponent's resources. But I guess the biggest weakness of the deck, in my opinion, is that sometimes it just feels like the ceiling is really low. Like, even when it gets to go first, it feels like some decks like Malice can just blow right through all their interruptions and still just OTK them, not giving them the chance to add stuff back from the graveyard and advance their game plan like that. It almost feels like the deck is too fair in some sense, like they don't have any big combos that generate a ton of advantage or anything like that. They just have some very simple cards that do, I guess, one thing, and sometimes it'll be enough to stop your opponent. So I feel like the deck's power level is a bit on the lower side. But all that being said though, I'll say something you probably heard of before when talking about this deck, but I think it's not a top 10 deck right now because it just needs a bit of a slower and more fair format to thrive. Like, the power level of Raziel, Mitsurugi, and Malice is just a little bit too high right now, but obviously it still has the potential to do well as we see because it has gotten some results here or there. I just feel like the perfect format for this would be in the future, where eventually the format will have slowed down a little bit and the power level of decks will have overall decreased a bit as well. The next deck I want to talk about is Fire King. This list got top 8 at the Toronto Regionals, and overall this is a pretty mid-rangey deck. So even though its end board of like Arvada plus like a Princess in the Graveyard doesn't look super impressive, they can suddenly pop off with a bunch of effects once a Fire Monster is destroyed, thanks to the Sacred Fire King Garunix. Like, you'll be able to pop a bunch of cards on your field, they'll be able to revive a bunch of cards onto their field. As soon as that first monster gets popped, like, the floodgates sort of open and they sort of just explode onto the board. I feel like this deck's biggest strength is that, in theory at least, it should match up pretty well against the best deck in Mitsurugi Raziel, since the Mitsurugi Raziel deck's disruption just mostly consists of destruction based effects. So think about cards like Murakumo and Detonator, they pop cards, but the Fire King monsters don't care about being popped. In fact, they actually benefit from being popped. So I think that Fire Kings is able to take advantage of just generally how the meta is positioned right now, with Mitsurugi Raziel being the best deck. Not to mention, Fire King also gets to play Dominus Impulse, which is arguably the best hand trap in the game right now. And they also play pretty well into common hand traps like Droll and Fuwa, since they can adjust their game plan very easily for either of those. It doesn't really need to do too much in order to set up a bunch of interruptions on your opponent's turn. Now, I think the biggest problem for this deck can feel like its consistency is a bit lacking at times. They generally require multiple card combos for them to really get going. Without a outlet like Consort Garunix or Fire King Island to pop fire monsters, it kind of becomes very hard for them to play when going first and get their engine rolling. So overall, I think that since the deck isn't the most consistent and the power level is noticeably lower than a deck like Malice or Mitsurugi Raziel, you probably need to pilot it super well and be able to use your interactions very skillfully in order to see good results. But that being said though, this is a deck that I think has a ton of potential just because of how the meta is overall positioned right now, with Raziel and Mitsurugi being the best deck. Finally, for the last underrated pick of the format, we have Odion Fiendsmith. This is the list that got top 4 at the Swiss Nationals, and honestly, to my surprise, it has seen a few other top cut placements in major events here or there. I admit that I'm a bit biased towards this deck, and I personally don't think it's very good, but in terms of results, it's actually seen quite a few, so I decided to ultimately include it. Now, I won't talk about what this deck tries to do because I already have a video talking about that on my channel already, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already done so. I'll leave a link in the description below. I'll talk about all the cards that you need to be aware of when it comes to the main engine of this deck, as well as a couple ways you can go ahead and try to beat it. Now, I think the main strength of this deck is just the lack of preparations that other decks have against it. Since it is a trap deck, they generally aren't siding for strategies like this, and they just generally aren't that well prepared to play into the type of interruption that this deck has. Now, this deck also has access to the Fiendsmith engine, which can just be enough to win games on its own at times just because of how powerful it is. Now, the biggest weakness I think of this deck, in my opinion, is that for being a trap deck, it still plays into common hand traps like Droll after your man with the Mark search, or Imperm on your man with the Mark. So it kind of feels like you're opening yourself up to losing the cards that otherwise shouldn't affect your type of like deck being a trap deck or like a control deck. So in some sense, it feels like this deck has like the worst of both worlds. It has the problems that the trap deck has when going second, but also has the problems that the combo decks have by being weak to common hand traps. But I also find that it struggles to use its engine pretty well when going second, since there are quite a few trap cards, and the cards themselves don't really play super well into boards most of the time. So overall, even though I personally don't think this deck is the greatest, it has seen quite a few results, and I think this is something you should keep your eye on and just be aware that it is a deck that can still do pretty well at a big event. So that's going to wrap up this video. Let me know what you think about all these decks in the comment section below. Do you think they're real, or do you think they're actually fraudulent? And are there any other decks that you think have a ton of potential this format? Let me know in the comments below as well, because I'm curious. And once again, be sure to check out my top 10 best decks for the June 2025 format. So if you don't see a deck on here, then it's probably on there already. And finally, before I wrap up the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to CardTrader. You can help the channel just by signing up with my affiliate link in the description below and using code TCG Sam for 5% off the cards you'd already be buying anyways. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.